For decades, Bigfoot stories were easy to dismiss: campfire tales, misidentified bears, or elaborate hoaxes. But what if the proof isn't a single blurry photo or a shaky audio clip? What if someone, somewhere, actually drew a map made of plaster casts, witness coordinates, and official reports, and then quietly buried it? Tonight, you will see that map. Tonight, you will follow the lines, the hot zones, and the impossible patterns that mainstream science shrugs at, and some agencies would rather keep off the public grid. This is not another anecdote. This map was built from physical evidence: plaster casts of footprints, sworn eyewitness locations, lab analyses, and restricted forest records. Each dot on that stitched-together chart represents a cast, a careful record, a moment when something large pressed into the earth and left a trace. Each color marks a decade. The lines between dots are not roads, they are repeated trails. Step back far enough and the points stop looking random. They become corridors. Imagine a map where prints clustered along river valleys and mountain passes, where repeated impressions gather near seasonal food sources, and oddly, where many of the densest clusters sit close to government-managed lands with limited public access. That pattern is the core revelation you'll encounter in this video. We will show you the evidence behind the map, explain the anomalies that scientists can't dismiss with a shrug, and reveal why parts of this record were redacted or locked away. Think of plaster molds lined up like a fossil record, each measured and cataloged. Think of redacted pages in land management logs and FOIA responses that return whole pages blacked out with the phrase "withheld" in the interest of public safety. That phrase is normally reserved for sensitive infrastructure, not footprint coordinates. Why scrub these locations? Is it liability, preservation, or control of a narrative that would invite crowds into fragile landscapes? We'll examine those motives and the quiet decisions that hid parts of the map. The footprint pattern itself is the real shock. Across decades and hundreds of miles, casts show consistent size ranges, toe alignment, and pressure distribution that don't match human barefoot prints or typical large animals. In several places, casts made 30 or 40 years apart fall within mere centimeters of one another. In others, prints thread through narrow passes and follow river corridors like highways. Such repeat use implies knowledge of terrain, seasonal movement, and perhaps a level of planning or territorial memory that most people refuse to imagine. By the end of this video, you will know where the most concentrated evidence lies, why certain pieces were suppressed, and what the footprint pattern suggests about the creature behind it. You'll also learn practical steps to take if you find a print in the wild, how to document without destroying evidence, how to preserve a cast, and how to push for records without trespassing. And you'll hear why some insiders believe the map points to more than an animal, a behavioral pattern that could force us to rethink wilderness movement, territoriality, and the reasons institutions choose discretion over disclosure. The promise is simple and serious. You will be shown the footprint map they don't want you to see, and you will be given the context to understand why it matters. Follow the lines with care. What they reveal changes the story of Bigfoot from isolated myth to a mapped pattern we can examine, question, and, if we act responsibly, bring into the light. You are promised something more than stories and blurry photos. To make that promise real, the map had to be built on things that survive scrutiny: physical evidence, sworn reports, lab work, and experts who would stake their names on what they found. This is the moment we lay out who made the map credible, not for internet argument, but for anyone who wants to know whether the pattern holds up under real examination. The map was not assembled by a single enthusiast in a garage. It grew from a coalition, retired Forest Service trackers who spent decades reading prints in mud and snow, independent researchers who cataloged casts and witness statements, geologists who analyzed soil displacement around deep impressions, and an engineer who spent years converting brittle plaster molds into georeferenced digital points. Those plaster casts are the map's bones. The paper reports, lab notes, and sworn affidavits are its tissue. The team insisted on traceable sources for every dot on the chart. Several names you might recognize in cryptid research circles reviewed pieces of the data. A retired state wildlife biologist turned over casts collected in the early 1990s and testified to their chain of custody. A forensic podiatrist measured stride length, pressure distribution, and toe alignment, then told the team in plain terms that several impressions did not match human barefoot prints or typical large carnivore patterns. He pointed out a recurring pressure spike on the outer metatarsal, a detail that shows up again and again on casts from different regions. And crucially, a former Department of Defense contractor who filed and won multiple FOIA requests confirmed the existence of internal reports that listed coordinates later redacted in public releases. Those redactions were not random typos, they were black boxes and otherwise routine logs. Take the 1980s marsh case as an example. Two experienced campers followed a trail of impressions for nearly a mile through saturated peat. They made multiple plaster casts, recorded precise bearings, and filed a report with regional land managers. Years later, a forensic lab assessed those casts and found dermal ridge patterns, depth distribution, and a lack of toe splay inconsistent with a human stepping barefoot or a large bear. The podiatrist identified gait asymmetry suggestive of deliberate movement, not panic or a stumbling animal. That cluster now appears on the map as a tightly grouped set of points tied to dated reports and lab results, the kind of cross-checked evidence the team demanded. That standard of proof is not rare inside the coalition. In one 2002 incident, a wildlife officer's log described impressions crossing a logging road in an area where large predators were seldom recorded. An internal safety memo from the logging company, obtained by an independent researcher, called the event anomalous undermining of equipment and asked for heightened security, language you don't expect from a company over a single footprint. Those memos, field notes, and casts were digitized and stitched into a spatial database by GIS analysts who turned messy archives into a coherent map. When analysts layered those points over topography, hydrology, and public land boundaries, patterns emerged that pure anecdote cannot create: repeat corridors along river valleys, clusters near seasonal food sources, and an odd frequency of reports near federal properties with restricted access. Early presentations of these preliminary maps at closed conferences drew private warnings. An ex-forest manager and a public lands attorney advised caution. They had seen redactions and withheld pages in official files and understood how quickly an evidence trail can be rerouted into secrecy. That warning is telling. The map sits at the junction of physical evidence, expert analysis, and institutional control. Each layer strengthens the others: a cast backed by a lab report, a witness affidavit matched to a land manager log, a redaction verified by a FOIA win. Taken together, those elements transform a scatter of stories into a dossier that demands explanation. This is not fringe folklore dressed up as science. It is a deliberate assembly of verifiable data that points to a real mystery. With that foundation laid, we can move to the anomalies and patterns that make the map more than a collection of curiosities, and prepare to reveal why the routes it draws matter. We've built a foundation of verified reports, lab notes, and now, before we pull the map into full view, consider a handful of anomalies that change the conversation from curious to unsettled. These are the threads that make the map readable as a pattern, not just a scatter of stories. Start with the casts. In the Pacific Northwest, a set of plaster molds kept by multiple researchers shows a toe configuration that simply does not match human feet or known large mammals. Under magnification, the dermal patterns reveal parallel striations and skin folds oriented in ways a primate podiatrist said he had not seen in any recorded human or ape. The toes show minimal splay and a pronounced outer pressure ridge that recurs across casts collected in different decades and different counties. Those are not the fingerprints of a single prankster. They are anatomical consistencies repeated far beyond what a hoaxer could reliably reproduce. Then there are the sensors, trail cameras, and acoustic logs placed in mapped zones. They don't give us a full glimpse of a creature most nights, but they do record moments that line up. Late summer captures, often at dusk or just after high water, show vague silhouettes moving along the same narrow ledges flagged by plaster casts. Acoustic files from the same grid record low, structured vocalizations, sequences of pulses rather than random animal calls around the same seasonal window. Those coincidences suggest timing, not chance. The pattern repeats where hydrology matters. During seasonal rises in river levels, certain valley routes become preferred. The movement looks adapted to water cycles, not merely opportunistic wandering. Soil and pressure analysis adds another layer. In several of the deeper impressions, forensic soil scientists found compression and displacement that extend beyond the visible print. That means weight was distributed in ways unlike a typical human step. The pressure gradient in these samples shows a rearward shift and lateral spread that hints at a different center of mass, perhaps a wider pelvis, different limb mechanics, or a gait that places force along an unusual axis. In plain terms, whatever made these impressions pushed Earth in a way that ordinary feet do not. Now look at the paperwork. Across multiple states, land management logs mentioning large non-human impressions arrived to citizen requesters with coordinates scrubbed. The stock phrase used to justify deletions was often withheld in the interest of public safety. That phrase normally protects specifics about critical infrastructure. Applied to footprint locations, it does more than hide a point on a map. It actively redirects public attention away from certain clearings and river bends. Researchers who pushed further found whole pages missing or replaced by boilerplate. One retired park ranger told years ago to log incidents only in general terms, kept copies of casts and annotated notes that he felt he could not submit while employed. After retirement, he quietly passed that material to an independent researcher. Those documents became a key seed for the spatial database we now hold. Timing and geography raise another question. Clusters of impressions often sit near military training sites and test ranges, places with large buffer zones, limited civilian traffic, and periodic closures. Local residents and some former base personnel recall routine sweeps and unexplained perimeter closures near the same seasons when camera captures spike. Why would a creature move close to such installations? There are simple practical reasons. Buffer zones offer reduced road traffic, consistent corridors cleared of dense undergrowth, and predictable schedules of human absence. There is also the human factor. Materials, debris, and small mammals attracted to installations could create food pockets. Those are plausible hypotheses. But the repeated alignment across different regions, where a cluster appears close to a base in Montana, another near a coastal testing range in Washington, and another near a missile range in the southeast, demands more than coincidence. Perhaps the most telling anomaly is replication over time. In a high-altitude basin, one research team digitized casts from 1978, 1999, and 2016. When plotted precisely, the impressions fall along the same narrow ledge and, when overlaid, match within centimeters. That's not the same rock being stepped on by different people. That is repeat use of the identical terrain in the same way by something with memory. Across the map, casts taken decades apart show near-identical dimensions and pressure patterns. That consistent limb morphology and force distribution argues for a persistent population with stable physical traits. Taken together, these threads change how you must read the map: the anatomy in the casts, the timing in the cameras and audio, the soil physics in the impressions, the selective redactions, and the proximity to controlled lands all point toward more than isolated anecdotes. They point toward repeated routes, seasonal timing, and a behavioral logic that knows the landscape. This is not random wandering. It looks like movement with intent, roots learned, maintained, and repeated over generations. We're not yet claiming a complete explanation. We are, however, asking you to accept a different baseline. The evidence is not merely strange, it is structured. It suggests a creature war, a population with territory, seasonal rhythms, and the intelligence to use human-made spaces to its advantage. With these anomalies understood, the full map no longer looks like a curiosity. It looks like a map made by a thinking presence. The map we built is not a single sheet of paper dropped in a drawer. It is a layered, digital dossier, plaster cast coordinates tied to lab reports, sworn eyewitness affidavits, ranger logs, and dated field notes, all overlaid on topography, hydrology, and public land boundaries. Pull those layers together, and the scatter of old stories resolves into routes. 5 major corridors across North America where footprint density spikes and patterns repeat. These are not random clusters, they form highways of evidence. We named the corridors where the dots concentrate: the Cascadia Ridge, the Inland Riverway, the Northern Intermontane, the Great Lakes Southern Shield Junction, and the Southern Appalachia Corridor. Each corridor follows landscape logic: river valleys, narrow mountain passes, cleared utility rights-of-way, and each links hubs where multiple forms of evidence overlap within a few hundred meters. These hubs are not one-off sightings. They are staging areas where plaster casts, camera captures, and independent witness reports intersect again and again. The Cascadia Ridge is the most striking example. 60 documented casts from 1965 through 2019 trace a narrow path along a major river gorge where old-growth pockets and steep benches create predictable travel lanes. A geologist who examined several casts noted the same hill-to-toe angle and an outer-foot pressure spike that recurs across states. When GIS analysts plotted the points against federal land maps, many fell inside managed forest boundaries, often in access-limited zones. One redacted federal memo we recovered via litigation explicitly referenced unusual persistent physical evidence in that corridor and directed regional staff to withhold GPS coordinates from public release, citing resource preservation and public safety. That phrasing is usually reserved for sensitive infrastructure, not footprint. Locations in its use here raises immediate questions. Across the Great Lakes Southern Shield Junction, the pattern looks different, but is no less compelling. Prints cluster on marsh islands and along abandoned logging roads. Local anglers and trappers, interviewed off the record, described hearing low, structured vocalizations in the fall when fishing drops off. In one community, a string of prints led to an abandoned ranger station where recent soil disturbances suggested nighttime digging. That discovery triggered a sealed county sheriff's investigation. Official files eventually produced to our team were heavily redacted, but they confirmed an episode of overnight disturbance and an effort to keep details from public bulletins. Perhaps the most controversial feature of the map is not a single hub but the way. Several of the densest clusters align with federal or military-managed lands. In 3 separate corridors, the most intense concentrations sit adjacent to restricted properties, not once, but repeatedly. A retired base engineer we interviewed said perimeter access roads near one cluster are closed for security sweeps on a schedule that never appeared in public notices. An ex-intelligence analyst told our team that when unusual biological activity is detected near critical infrastructure, the default is to classify and contain rather than publicly disclose, both to protect installations and to avoid causing alarm. When those procedural choices meet a physical map of repeated impressions, the result is a set of records that can be selectively released, redacted, or quietly archived. Zooming in from corridor to cast to toe groove reveals other, harder-to-ignore facts. The most compelling hubs contain multiple casts whose anatomical features line up: consistent length ranges, similar toe alignment, repeating pressure signatures. In narrow passes, casts taken decades apart plot on near-identical lines. One high-altitude basin produced casts from 1978, 1999, and 2016 that, when digitized and overlaid, match within centimeters along the same ledge. That degree of replication is not the footprint equivalent of coincidence. It suggests repeat use of specific terrain by something that remembers roots. Those connections change how we must read the map. The corridors don't simply link food sources, they stitch together seasonal refuges, probable birthing zones, and long-term travel lanes. Repeated impressions in funnel points, narrow cliffside ledges, river fords, low-elevation saddles indicate predictable routes rather than opportunistic wandering. The morphology of the prints strengthens that case. Forensic podiatrists who examined multiple casts found gait asymmetries and weight distributions inconsistent with known human barefoot movement or the paw mechanics of large bears. The same unusual outer-foot pressure spikes showed up across states and decades. Hoaxers, even if coordinated, would find it difficult to reproduce the same biomechanical signature across hundreds of miles and 50 years. Put plainly, when verified physical evidence, sworn observations, lab analysis, and land management records all line up, the simplest explanation is no longer random anecdotes. The map speaks of repeated, organized movement. It suggests a population, whatever it may be, with territorial memory and an ability to exploit landscape features, including human-maintained clearings and buffer zones, to move with regularity. This is the first half of our central revelation. The footprint map, built from physical and documentary evidence and refined by GIS work, points to real and persistent movement patterns. Crucially, some of those patterns intersect with lands where agencies have the authority to hide, redact, or withhold details. That intersection is where the mystery deepens. Not only is there a trail to follow, but parts of that trail run through rooms where decisions are made about what the public gets to see. If the map points to real corridors, and if some of those corridors run through files that were redacted, the natural next question is, what do we do with that knowledge? The answer is not to storm the woods with torches and cameras. The answer is a method, a set of legal, scientific, and civic steps that turn suppressed coordinates into verifiable data without risking safety, contamination, or legal trouble. Below, I'll lay out a clear, practical plan the map implies. Verify, analyze, protect, and press. First, verify through proper channels. Never treat a redaction as an end. Treat it as a lead. Start by requesting records where possible, but do it smartly. Broad FOIA requests get broad denials. Narrowly worded requests force agencies to release discrete documents. Ask for specific incident reports tied to a date range and defined administrative unit rather than all records related to Bigfoot. If you can, cite the exact case numbers or ranger logs referenced on the map's public layer. Be polite, precise, and prepared to appeal. In multiple cases, researchers widen the map's open layer by filing successive surgical FULA petitions, each one peeling back a little more. Persistence matters. Agencies sometimes respond only after several targeted requests and an appeal. Second, collaborate with accredited experts. Physical evidence is only as strong as the lab that vets it. When a new cast is found, it should be documented and preserved, then analyzed by a lab with a chain of custody protocol and published methods. Contact forensic podiatrists, soil scientists, and biomechanical engineers before you collect anything. They will tell you what data matters: calibrated GPS, metric photo scales, weight distribution photos, a sketch of stride lines, and undisturbed soil samples from the print perimeter. Analyzed and peer-reviewed work shifts the conversation from internet claim to documented anomaly, and documented anomalies force institutions to respond differently. Third, protect evidence and preserve chain of custody. Too many early leads were lost because people tried to help and accidentally destroyed the proof. If you must take a cast, use gloves, photograph the print from multiple angles with a scale present, and pour plaster or resin cast using a rigid rim to protect the impression. Seal casts in labeled, tamper-vetted bags and create duplicates. Deposit one duplicate with a neutral academic lab or a state university geology or anthropology department. Keep detailed field notes, time coordinates, whether footwear you were wearing, names of witnesses. Labs will not accept samples that arrive without documentation. When evidence is preserved correctly, it survives scientific scrutiny and legal pressure. Fourth, use the map tactically to guide public pressure. The map makes redactions visible, that is leverage. Citizens can petition for records with legal arguments grounded in public land accountability. Organized, narrow campaigns have succeeded where scattershot outrage failed. Start local. Gather neighbors, file targeted FOIs with county sheriff or forest district offices, and demand receipts for submitted reports. When the county refuses, use transparency laws to force the issue. Combine legal requests with requests for independent review by university labs. When the public can show that casts exist and have been analyzed, the institutional cost of continued secrecy rises. Fifth, build networks of vetted contributors. The MAP project grew because independent researchers, retired forest trackers, and small labs coordinated. If you find something, reach out to an established researcher rather than posting raw images online. Established teams can advise on preservation, help submit FOIAs correctly, and, crucially, act as neutral intermediaries that make agencies take the evidence seriously. Networks also offer redundancy. When one channel stalls, another can push, appeal, or take the documentation to a different agency. Sixth, respect law and safety. Many of the map's densest clusters sit near restricted facilities or fragile habitats. Trespassing into these areas risks arrest and can lead to the destruction of the very evidence you seek. If you suspect a site is sensitive, observe from legal vantage points. Document what you can without entering restricted zones, and forward concerns to law enforcement with a request for an incident number. If you discover signs of excavation or vandalism, treat it as a potential crime scene and notify authorities immediately. Finally, accept that suppression is driven by mixed motives. Authorities sometimes redact coordinates to prevent damage to fragile ecosystems or to avoid liability. At other times, redaction shields infrastructure, but public lands belong to the public. Redactions cannot be a blanket substitute for accountability. Use the map not to inflame, but to focus legal challenges, scientific review, and measured public scrutiny. Turn the map's visible gaps into specific requests for explanation. Why was this coordinate redacted? Who made the decision? And what documentation supports that judgment? This is a tactical plan, not a conspiracy manifesto. It channels curiosity into reproducible science and lawful action. If the corridors are real, the best way to reveal them is through careful documentation, smart legal pressure, accredited analysis, and coordinated civic effort. The map gives us direction. Now the work is in the steps we take next. If you reach this point, you already know the map points to patterns, not gossip. Now you need a practical, lawful way to turn that revelation into useful evidence. The following steps are what any concerned, careful person can do today to contribute without putting themselves or others at risk. This is about method, not spectacle. Step 1. Get the map's public layer and learn it. Download the open dataset and load it into a basic mapping tool, Google Earth, QGIS, or even a simple online map viewer. Compare the public points with your own local knowledge, roads, trailheads, seasonal streams, and places with restricted access. The open layer is not a field guide. It's a context map. Use it to see whether your neighborhood sits inside a corridor or near a cluster. Mark nearby points on your private map for further legal observation. Step 2. Observe without disturbing. If you see a suspicious impression or sign, photograph it from a distance first. Take wide-angle shots for context, show the trail, vegetation, and approach routes. Then take close-ups with a metric scale, a ruler, coin, or photographer's scale placed next to the print. Always photograph before touching. Record GPS coordinates with a calibrated device or a reliable smartphone app and note the exact time and weather. These small metadata details make the difference between an anecdote and evidence. Step 3. Preserve chain of custody. If you must lift a cast, consult an established researcher first. Hasty handling destroys scientific value. If experts are unavailable, follow this minimal protocol. Wear disposable gloves, photograph before contact, stabilize the print with a rigid frame, lightweight boards, or a purpose-built casting box to prevent collapse, and mix casting material according to manufacturer instructions. Once set, place casts in labeled sealable bags with date, coordinates, and collector name. Create at least 2 copies when possible, one to submit to a neutral lab or university, and one for your own records. Never leave a cast unattended at a public location. Step 4. Use simple tools to add credibility. A calibrated GPS, a photo scale, and time-stamped images create verifiable metadata. Free tools like Google Earth Pro let you overlay your find on historical imagery and topography. Basic GIS layers show whether the point sits in a floodplain, along a ridge, or inside a restricted buffer. These overlays can reveal whether a print matches a repeated corridor on the map. If you have access to a local university, ask a geography or geology student to help with an overlay. Many will assist pro bono for a real data set. Step 5. Document and report properly. Submit initial reports to local land managers, forestry offices, or park rangers and request a written receipt or incident number. Simultaneously, contact independent researchers who have contributed to the compiled map. They can provide advice, help arrange laboratory testing, or act as neutral intermediaries with agencies. If local officials refuse to engage, use narrowly worded FOIA requests focused on specific dates, coordinates, or report numbers rather than broad, sweeping demands. Precise language forces agencies to produce non-sensitive records faster and avoids easy Step 6. Partner with accredited labs and experts. Plaster casts and soil samples are only as valuable as the analysis behind them. Work with labs that document methods, who tested the sample, what was measured, and how results were reproduced. For footprints, forensic podiatry, soil compression analysis, and biomechanical stride assessment matter. When a lab return includes a signed methods section and raw data, that file can be cited in follow-up FOIAs and public petitions. Step 7. Protect yourself legally and physically. Do not trespass on private property, federal installations, or obvious critical infrastructure. Many mapped clusters sit near restricted sites. Approaching those zones risks arrest and undermines credibility. If you suspect the site is sensitive, observe and document from legal vantage points only. If you encounter signs of excavation or vandalism, treat the area as a potential crime scene. Notify law enforcement, get an incident number, and avoid altering the site. Step 8. Preserve institutional ties. Deposit duplicates of high-value casts or soil samples with neutral institutions, a university geology lab, a regional museum, or a dedicated research coalition. These institutions can store materials under controlled conditions, provide chain of custody continuity, and serve as witnesses if questions arise about mishandling. Step 9. Share responsibly. When you post findings publicly, include the raw data, scale photos, coordinates, timestamps, and procedural notes. Invite peer review by independent scientists. Avoid sensational language and stick to facts. A calm, well-documented claim is harder to dismiss than a dramatic headline. Finally, use the map as leverage for transparency. When you find a point with suspicious redactions nearby, file a focused FOIA, cite the date range, specific coordinates, and the phrase large non-human impressions or similar language if it appears in public summaries. Political pressure works best when it's precise. Community petitions that collect documented, professionally analyzed reports are far more effective than scattered social media posts. This work is not about spectacle. It is about slow, disciplined evidence building. The map gives us direction. These steps turn curiosity into reproducible science and legal pressure. Do this carefully, legally, and collaboratively. Protect the sites, protect yourself, and let the evidence do the talking. The corridors are there to be mapped, not trampled. And when we map them responsibly, we force institutions to answer. We started this series with a promise to show the footprint map they don't want you to see and to give you the context to understand why it matters. Now, after paper trails, plaster casts, lab notes, and quiet admissions from retired officers and researchers, the picture becomes unavoidable. This dossier is not a stack of gossip. It is a layered compilation of physical evidence, sworn observations, and official records, pieces that line up across decades and terrain. The corridors on that map are not random. They are repeated routes, staging areas, and contact points where multiple forms of evidence converge. That convergence is the central truth you should take away. The implications are simple and urgent. First, what we've mapped suggests persistence. When prints, camera captures, and observer reports cluster in the same small areas over years, we are not looking at a one-off hoax or a seasonal fluke. We are looking at patterns consistent with animals or populations that remember routes, use terrain predictably, and return to favored grounds. When those routes intersect with lands where agencies control access and information, it explains why many records were redacted or withheld. Secrecy does not prove a conspiracy by itself, but it creates a gap where ordinary public oversight cannot function. That gap must be closed with evidence and law, not speculation and trespass. Second, the map reframes responsibility. This is not about hunting a headline. It is about building a defensible body of data. Casts handled correctly, photographs with scale and metadata, and records requested and archived in standard legal formats are the currency that forces institutional response. When labs can reproduce anomalous features in a controlled way, when county records corroborate field notes, and when FOIA returns unredacted pages that match physical evidence, denial becomes harder to sustain. That is the leverage the public now holds. Third, this is a civic issue. Many of the map's most intense clusters lie on public lands, the very places the public has a right to access, use, and demand transparency about. When records are redacted in the interest of public safety without clear justification, citizens should ask for the legal basis. Focused FOIA requests, targeted public records demands, and coordinated petitions by communities living near these corridors have already produced results in some counties. Use the map as a precise tool for civic pressure. It shows where to ask, what to ask for, and which agencies to hold accountable. So what does responsible action look like now? First, document with discipline. If you find a footprint or anomaly, photograph it immediately with a metric scale and a time-stamped device. Record GPS, weather, and context. Photos that show surrounding terrain. Do not alter, touch, or dig. If possible, place an unobtrusive marker nearby so the location can be relocated by others without disturbing the site. Second, preserve chain of custody. If a cast must be taken, do it with gloves, a rigid frame, and duplicate casts. Deposit a copy with a neutral institution, a university lab, or regional museum, and get written receipts. Those receipts will matter if you later need to compel a public agency to compare its records to your material. Third, use legal channels before anything else. Submit findings to local land managers and request an official incident number. File narrowly worded FOIAs that cite dates, coordinates, and exact phrases seen in public summaries. When agencies respond with redaction, when appeals fail, organize public records requests through community groups or legal advocates who will escalate the case. Fourth, build scientific partnerships. Reach out to the independent researchers already contributing to the map. Pool resources so casts and soil samples can be tested by accredited labs with documented methodologies. Peer review, even in targeted pockets, changes the conversation from anecdote to data. Finally, resist the urge to trespass, to sensationalize, or to chase viral fame. Reckless behavior not only endangers people and property, it discredits legitimate inquiry and hands institutions an easy excuse to dismiss the evidence. This map is a tool for measured action, not a map for a crowd to storm remote clearings. We've shown you where the layers line up: physical impressions, witness testimony, and institutional records that sometimes end in redaction. Each layer strengthens the others. Each withheld page creates the need for more rigorous documentation, more precise legal pressure, and smarter public oversight. The choice now is collective. Let the map remain in obscurity, buried under secrecy and rumor, or treat it as a directive. Press for transparency with preserve evidence with professional care. Collaborate with scientists and legal advocates. Use the map to focus civic attention rather than spectacle. Do this patiently, legally, and methodically. Footprints tell a story. They mark movement, presence, and intent. When enough of them are gathered, the story becomes readable. We have pulled a corner of that story into the light. The map is only the beginning. If you want the rest of it revealed, act with rigor, demand accountability, and keep following the corridors where the evidence leads. The truth isn't behind a single redaction. It's in the work we choose to do to uncover what those redactions hide. There is one last crucial piece to this story: how we move from revelation to real, lasting knowledge without turning the map into gossip or a danger. The corridors on the map are not only lines on paper, they are resources, habitats, and increasingly contested information. What we do next will determine whether these prints become the seed of serious science or the fodder for sensationalism. So here's a practical, ethical, and strategic plan for anyone who wants to help, and a warning about what to avoid. First, organize locally. Think nationally. Individual discoveries matter, but coordinated effort changes outcomes. Form small, accountable groups that pair experienced outdoors people with legal and scientific advisors. Keep membership transparent. Assign clear roles: a documentation lead, a legal liaison, a lab coordinator, and a media contact. Small teams can respond quickly, maintain chain of custody, and avoid the chaos that turns finds into unreliable anecdotes. Second, learn the paperwork before touching the ground. If you live near a mapped corridor, become fluent in FOIA basics, public records law, and land management procedures for your jurisdiction. Templates and sample requests already used successfully by our coalition are available through the researchers who compiled the map. Use precise language, dates, unit designations, and specific phrases used in the original redactions to force agencies to produce responsive documents. When an agency replies with redactions, appeal. When appeals fail, escalate through recognized public interest law groups that will take on cases with clear public lands angles. Third, fund the science. Accredited lab work costs money, and evidence left untested means little. Pool resources through crowdfunding, local grants, or partnerships with universities. Offer reproducible samples to geology, biology, and biomechanics departments in exchange for analysis and student involvement. Labs that operate under documented protocols will make it much harder for critics to dismiss results as anecdotal or contaminated. Transparency about methods and funding reduces suspicion and increases credibility. Fourth, protect the places. The map exposes fragile terrain that can be easily damaged by too many boots. Advocate for protective measures that do not require secrecy. Seasonal closures where prints concentrate. Educational signage about preserving evidence and official monitoring programs. Pressure local land managers to adopt non-destructive monitoring protocols rather than blanket secrecy. Conservation-minded stewardship, Both preserves potential evidence and undercuts the argument for redaction on public safety grounds. Fifth, partner with reputable journalists and scientists. Pitch well-documented stories to outlets with a track record of investigative rigor. Provide raw data, notarized affidavits, lab reports, and chain of custody records. When journalists can corroborate documents and quote named scientists, the story moves from fringe to mainstream scrutiny. That public attention is the lever that can pry open redacted files and force accountable responses. Sixth, establish clear, ethical rules. Never lure wildlife, never use bait or lights to provoke encounters, and never trespass on restricted land. If security personnel challenge you near a sensitive site, document the interaction calmly and withdraw. If you find evidence of excavation or soil disturbance that suggests criminal activity, report it immediately and request an incident number. Ethics safeguard both people and the integrity of the data. Seventh, prepare for expect distraction campaigns, online hoaxers, and institutional stonewalling. Meet those challenges with evidence, patience, and process. Publish results in stages, raw data for transparency, peer-reviewed analysis for credibility, and narrative accounts to keep public attention focused on method, not spectacle. Finally, remember why any of this matters. These footprints, whether they belong to an unclassified animal population or point to unknown patterns of landscape, are part of a larger story about who controls public knowledge. The map shows corridors of movement and corridors of silence. By insisting on careful documentation, legal pressure, and scientific partnership, the public can demand better answers than secrecy or dismissal. This is a call to steady work, not a rush to the woods. Gather the evidence properly, shield the places that need shielding, and use the law and science as your tools. The footprints will not speak if we trample them. They will speak when we listen carefully, record precisely, and press for transparency. The map is only the start. What comes next depends on whether we choose rigor over spectacle, patience over panic, and truth over withholding.